Hey everyone, I'm Tom and welcome to the channel. And yes, I do think that Discovery by J.A.J. Minton, also known as Talking Story here on BookTube, is absolutely worth the read. And this is actually a book that made me very glad that I changed up my review style. In the past, when I would review or talk about a book, I basically would finish it and as quickly as I could turn around and just kind of spew my thoughts out into the world and call that a review. And this is a book that makes me so glad that's not really what I do anymore. I let books sit with me now and really think about them. And if I decide to do a review for them, I kind of have my thoughts a little bit more collected. And that is because this is a book that all the pieces don't click into place until like the very last bit of this book. This is a book that starts out on like a rip-roaring roller coaster ride of like a thriller kind of story, really slows down and really gets into some like nitty-gritty stuff that personally I questioned how it integrated with the rest of the story. And then at the end, it slams all of these puzzle pieces together all at one time that I think just really ends up illustrating a really beautiful story and gives you enough answers to the questions that you had, but also lays out the rest of the story in a really interesting way. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about this book in a little bit more detail, just because I think it is one that deserves it. And it is just a really interesting story and something that is very outside of my wheelhouse. So I mentioned that this book is very out of my wheelhouse because it is technically like a cosmic horror story. And the only other cosmic horror that I think I have really read is Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. And I read that so long ago. I didn't read it at a good time. It's probably one of those books that I should go back and kind of reevaluate, but I didn't really enjoy that. And then some people would consider my favorite series of all time, the Three Body Problem, a somewhat cosmic horror book. It's not really what I would consider it. It's not what I think of when I think of cosmic horror, which is when you get into that kind of conversation. But I think this definitely is squarely in that realm, and I didn't know what to expect. Obviously, I expected, Cthulhu basically, and we do get some of those elements in here, but this is also a book that I think looks at characters and specific characters in the larger relationship of the world and what makes certain characters special. To me, the characters are really what makes this story. This is broken into a couple of different parts, and the first part of the story was definitely my favorite, and it is that thriller like exploration. We start with a crew that is trying to find a ship that has sunk, and we basically are just following this crew trying to do it, and then weird things start to happen, and basically they end up discovering something that kind of changes the entire world. And that whole opening section had me absolutely enthralled. I thought the character Nessa there was absolutely fantastic. She's kind of a fish pulled out of the pond and brought into something that's way over her head, but then somehow just is able to execute in a way that really impresses her boss and everything. And it's just the kind of story that I was like, okay, this is the kind of story we're getting. And then the brakes are slammed and our point of view is changed completely. And we start getting these other characters brought in that to me at the time, it made no sense to me how these characters were connected. And it was a really difficult thing for me because I was so invested in the early on parts of this story that when we switched perspectives, I was like, what are we doing? What is going on? And I just kept waiting for it to come back around. And like I mentioned in the very start of this video, not everything comes all the way back around until you get later and later into the book and you start putting those pieces together, which I really do think is actually really brilliant storytelling. And it's one of those things where I do think you have to be a little bit of a patient reader to fully enjoy this book because you need to see all of these things come together. And when they do, it is brilliant and beautiful. And each section brings in characters that I really, really ended up liking, which is obviously a huge positive. So let's talk about the characters first. And there are a couple that really stick out to me first. The first one being Manny DiMartini, who is the character we follow in the first section of this book. He is just a zany, really kind of crazy game show host kind of guy. But you also see like this really interesting descent into madness. And the whole time reading this book, I was just like, there's no way we have seen the last of this person. Now, I can't tell you if that's true or not, but it is just like a thought in the back of your head because he had mentioned times, throughout this book where you're just like, ooh, is this the time where he's going to show up? What is going to happen? And he is just a very interesting character. The next two there are two very different characters, but they end up kind of being one to me, and that would be Nessa and Howard Winfield. I think one shows like the big person who kind of has all of the power behind the scenes and is pulling strings and is definitely doing things that may or may not be good for all of humanity, but in this world, he feels like he's doing what is best. I don't know. I always find that kind of character interesting where they could be on either side of that spectrum, right? They could be the super good guy, the savior that everybody needs, or they are just trying to gain from their own political things. And I also think he has a very interesting backstory that obviously you get a little bit into here, but there's not all of the questions are answered about Mr. Howard Winfield, and also I'm going to call her his assistant, Nessa. I think she is just a really interesting character who is one of those threads that then ties into later in the story. But she is the one who I was talking about, where she's kind of the fish pulled out of water, brought into with the higher ups, and just really impresses. And she, I think, was just a really good way to visualize some of the early parts of the story in that first section. After that, we have Lucia, who I actually thought was, I had difficulties with her, actually. I thought she was very interesting, but I couldn't help but think of people I know in real life. She's basically a coding prodigy, right? And if you don't know, I have a degree in computer science, and I have met people who are just like, it seems like they are gifted, that they are meant to be doing this. And it's always a really interesting thing when you meet somebody who just like thinks on a different level than you at something you think you're pretty decent at, right? And so I don't know if that just made her a little bit more difficult for me to relate to, or I just kept thinking of people in my real life, which is just always a funny thing. But she definitely is super important to the story. And I actually think there's a time in the story where she goes somewhere else. And I think that was some of the most fascinating things in the entire story. For me, then I would also have to mention there's a nun in the story, and I ended up finding her to be one of the most interesting characters in the entire story. Just her whole backstory, everything that happened there, and just she is really kind of, to me, one of the linchpins of this story, and I just found her to be absolutely fascinating. Now let's quickly switch over to the plot. So the plot is that there's a discovery made. I mean, the name of the book is Discovery, right? And basically that discovery changes everything. And I will say one thing that I would have expected more is we kind of get a little bit of a societal collapse after this discovery, right? And one thing I wish was that it got explored a little bit more, or we just didn't have any societal collapse. There was this kind of weird like give and take where everything kind of collapsed, but not really, but kind of. And I don't know, I just felt like it never got committed to one way or the other, which is fine, because I think in the end it ends up working out. Society reestablished itself and everything. And it's just, I don't know if it was supposed to be something like the pandemic where things kind of like changed, but not drastically, but there was, and just, I'm not 100% sure. I would love, maybe I can ask them, J.A.J. Minton, that question, just to see what the thoughts were around like the societal collapse of this discovery. Because in my mind, I would think that it would be less, honestly, with what happened in the story. I don't think we would see a giant collapse from this kind of discovery. I don't know, maybe I'm just more optimistic than other people are here. I think it would be something that most people would just continue on with their life. If I'm gonna be completely honest, it's what I would do. It's been there. We're going to just keep on going because why not? I got bills to pay and things to do, food to eat, all that kind of stuff. But maybe that's just a very optimistic way of looking at it, and I'm just being a little bit delusional. But I will say that that is just like the cornerstone of the plot that I feel like is going to be connected probably later in the series, because after that, the plot turns into kind of creating things around this discovery and the development of new technologies and everything. And that was something that I definitely did struggle with as far as the plot goes. To me, it definitely was such a turn in what was going on that I wasn't ready for it, but it all ends up working in the end. So it's, like I said, one of those books where I'm very glad that I was patient with it. And then the very last thing I do want to talk about is just kind of the cosmic core. This is normally where if I was talking about a fantasy book, I would talk about like the magic system or something. And the cosmic core here, to me, is used very sparingly, but when it is used, it is hyper effective. Like absolutely, when it is sprinkled in, it is absolutely fantastic. There's some scenes at the very end of this book that I was not expecting. I didn't think we were going to get something like that, but I think they were absolutely fantastically done, and really just showed that we have no idea what is going on at this grand cosmic scale, and we're only going to get to explore that as we get more and more into this book. So this is a book, like I said, the more that I have sat with it, the more I enjoyed it in retrospect, because it really took getting to the end of it and seeing how everything really connected from beginning to end. When I first finished this book, I gave it a 3-star, which means I like it. My grading system is very rough. Like 3 and 4 stars are like most people's 4 and 5 stars. So that probably helps people think about it that way. But the more I sit with this, the more I think it might be climbing closer to a 4-star. I don't know if I'll end up changing it completely, but I do absolutely think that this is a book that is worth reading, and that if you haven't picked it up yet, you absolutely should. But that's all for me. Let me know what your thoughts are if you have read this down below in the comments, and remember to read what you want when you want.